All right, we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Ferrante. I am with the Sierra Club. I'm going to go over a few things before handing off to our moderator and panelists tonight. We want to thank everyone for joining. We want to thank participant media for making this event possible. And also our list of sponsors. If we could go to the next slide, I just wanted to see everyone's logos. We want to thank Clean and Healthy New York, Earthjustice, Green Inside and Out, and the New York Sustainable Business Council for co-sponsoring. We're really thankful to all of them for promoting as well. We hope everyone listening and watching had an opportunity to watch the movie Dark Waters, and thank you all for joining us in this digital event. So the next slide is going to lay out a few things about digital tech stuff that we need to take care of at the top of the call. So due to the size of this live event, we have muted all participants and ask you to use the chat feature and send questions via the chat. My colleagues from Sierra Club will be monitoring the chat and sharing some useful resources during this event. You can choose how you would like to view up in the upper corner. You can choose speaker view in the top right-hand corner of your screen to see just the person talking, or gallery view if you want to see everyone. If you have some bandwidth challenges with Wi-Fi, you can turn off your video, which is in the lower menu bar, which may improve the incoming sound and video quality. You'll go to the next slide. We'll hear from our panelists first tonight. Use the second half of the hour for question and answers from the audience. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Ansje Miller, who is on the National Sierra Club Board of Directors and is also the Executive Director of Health and Environmental Funders Network. So thank you so much, Ansje, for moderating, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And welcome, everybody. I am really excited to be here moderating this panel for what is a fantastic film. And a really great panel that's joining us today. So let's kick things off. 2020 has been an impossibly challenging year. We are definitely glad to be here and build community with you in this really challenging time. And tonight's story is a somber one and shines a bright light on the failure of national environmental laws to fully protect people and families from the harmful effects of toxic chemicals. It's a story with many heroes, and we are lucky enough to have several of them with us here tonight. We'll hear from attorney Rob Blott, who is the author of the book Exposure and the man who Mark Ruffalo played in the movie Dark Waters. We'll also be joined by New York heroes Mark Favors, Laureen Hackett, and Gartner. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to remember our colleague and friend, Cecil Corbin Mark. Cecil was the co-chair of the Just Green Partnership, of which the Sierra Club was a member and many folks on the call participated. He was the deputy director of We Act for Environmental Justice, a fierce environmental advocate, championing toxics laws both in New York State and nationwide. He's a longtime personal friend of mine. I've known and worked with Cecil on climate justice issues and toxics issues for north of 30 years. And so he was a huge champion in our field, and we owe a lot to Cecil's advocacy. And one thing I just want to share about Cecil, for those of you who knew him, for those of you who didn't know him, he approached all of this with love. Anytime you met Cecil, you just felt the love. And as we're fighting for our health, as we're fighting for our environment, that's what it's all about, love. And so we're really happy to be able to dedicate this session tonight to Cecil Corbin Mark and his activism on toxics work in New York State and beyond. So let's kick things off tonight with Rob Bilott. Rob is the lawyer profiled in the movie Dark Waters. In 1989, Mr. Blott picked up the case of Wilbur Tennant, a Parkersburg, West Virginia resident whose cattle were dying from a mysterious illness. He spent the next few decades surrounded by legal files, uncovering evidence of serious wrongdoing by DuPont. Mr. Bilott's legal struggle won a multi-million-dollar settlement for 70,000 people in the region and launched a massive health study linking PFAS exposure to 6 major health problems. He's been engaged in legal actions against PFAS polluters ever since. In addition to being profiled by Mark Ruffalo in Dark Waters, Rob recently published a book about the case entitled Exposure, Poisoned Water, Corporate Greed, and One Lawyer's 20-Year Battle Against DuPont. Welcome, Rob. Can you tell us your story of discovering the crisis posed by PFAS chemicals from Parkersburg and now our global understanding of their impact?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much. I really appreciate the fact that all of you that are participating tonight, those of you that are watching, that are taking time out to have this discussion with us this evening. This is incredibly important, and this is so encouraging to have folks getting together talking about these issues. And as those of you who saw the movie Dark Waters, you see what it took for one community to get the story out about what was happening with just one of these PFAS chemicals. Chemicals we now know include a family of chemicals that are hundreds, if not thousands, of these related chemicals that are turning up not just in one community along the Ohio River, but in the drinking water of communities all over this country, all over the planet. And now we're knowing it's not just one chemical in our water, it's hundreds of these things that are out there. And they're not only getting in our water, but our soil, our air, the plants, wildlife, polar bears, Arctic ice, it's everywhere. And massive worldwide contamination on pretty unprecedented scale. And it took 20 years to get that story out to the rest of the public so that we're all here able to talk about this. It's incredibly fortunate to have folks like those that participate, Mark Ruffalo, who saw the need to get this story out to the community, to everyone across the country and across the world, really, so that people realize this is something impacting all of us and how important it is for every one of us in our local communities, in communities dealing with these chemicals, particularly in New York State. Like going back into Hoosick Falls, this is something that popped up, one of the first places in the country outside of West Virginia where these chemicals were finally understood to be in the water and people finally started realizing the scope of this. But to take this story out and show people how important it is for somebody like Mr. Tennant to stand up, speak out, and take action, or the community coming together, the 69,000 people in that community who all came together, provided their own blood and their medical information to help make sure that the science was done so that all of us now understand what's happening here. And as you see in that story, that story was pretty much the story of that one chemical. What we now know, though, is we are dealing with a lot of these, the replacement chemicals, as you see at the very end of the film, things like Gen X, things like Adana, C4s, C6s, chemicals that are slightly tweaked. And now the argument we're hearing from folks is, well, we need to start all over again. And now we need more research on these new chemicals. And hopefully when people take a look at this story, people have the discussions we're having and realize how much we do know about these chemicals, how much has already been done. We can take steps to make sure that no other communities have to do this. We don't have to go through this in all these individual communities all across the country, all throughout New York. We can work on what we already know and take steps to protect people now. And so I'm really encouraged that we're here able to talk about this. I'm trying to do what I can, even through new litigation since what you see in the film, to try to get studies done on a national scale for this bigger group of chemicals. And most importantly, to have the companies that put these out there, knowing they get in our water, in our blood, make them pay for it, not the taxpayers, not the states, not the water providers, not the communities, and not the residents. So thank you all for being here this evening. And I really look forward to having the talk. I am so grateful for the folks that are here on the panel too from New York. I know them well, and you're doing tireless work to raise this issue in New York, and look forward to talking with all of you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you so much for your courage and man, watching that movie, just all the tireless hours you put into it is just phenomenal. So thank you so much for that. Next, we're going to hear from Mark Favors. So Mark is a military veteran, PFAS advocate, and a nurse on the front lines of the coronavirus. Mark grew up in the Fountain Valley, south of Colorado Springs. And in 2016, he and other area residents discovered that they had been drinking water contaminated with PFAS from nearby Peterson Air Force Base. Mark is joining us today from New York City, where he lives. Mark, so Dark Waters tells the story of DuPont poisoning drinking water in Parkersburg, West Virginia. But your family and others experienced something quite similar outside of the state. Can you tell us what effects have PFAS chemicals had on your family and your community?
Thank you for having me. And also, when you talked about Cecil Corbin Mark, you know, he was somebody before movies came out. He supported me. He had me meet environmental justice advocates from around the country to tell our story about PFAS. So, you know, he was a great person, a great supporter of our issue and our cause. Yeah, I was born and raised in Colorado Springs, Colorado. You know, when we learned in 2016 that Peterson Air Force Base, through toxic firefighting foam, that they had been dumping into our drinking water source for decades. The contamination started in 1970 and continued until 2016. A lot of my family members were sick of cancer, kidney cancer, which, you know, through Rob in the movie, had US courts and, you know, scientific research have linked to PFAS contamination, kidney cancer. About 5 members of my family died from kidney cancer. No one who lived outside the area, none of my family members who lived outside the area have had kidney cancer. In fact, we just buried a cousin, Ansje, a couple of weeks ago in the National Cemetery in Colorado Springs, because a lot of my family members are veterans. So a lot of our family members that have died from cancer linked to PFAS, ironically, are now buried in national cemeteries, not for any wounds from their duties overseas in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Vietnam, but, you know, from cancer under this, you know, cloud of suspicion from PFAS. And, you know, it's the military has admitted there's over 400 military bases, mostly in the United States, that have PFAS contamination at toxic levels on their bases. You know, Newburgh, New York is a place that we work closely with, the Newburgh Clean Water Project and for the National PFAS Coalition there. A place of, you know, military contamination in New York, you know, and you'll hear later about Hoosick Falls. So we're just trying to, you know, deal with the situation. I had, you know, a cousin who was at 14. He had to have a kidney transplant a few years ago. His mother lived in the area since she was 10 years old. So, you know, the big difference between, say, Parkersburg and dealing with, you know, military contamination is, number one, the military has legal immunity. So, which is why they didn't seem to mind admitting that they actually dumped the PFAS chemicals into our drinking water source since 1991 for several times a year until 2016. And to give you another comparison, if you watch the movie, a lot of people were upset when they took action against DuPont, because DuPont was a big employer of the town. And I think at that time, DuPont maybe employed probably 3,000 people in Parkersburg. Worldwide, 98,000 people they employed. In my hometown, currently of Colorado Springs, Colorado, the DOD employs 100,000 people alone. So that's why it's very hard to get electeds to take on the military and the DOD. So we just have to keep advocating. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. And I'm sorry for all of your loss and the health problems in your community. That is, that's heartbreaking. Now we'll bring in Laureen Hackett. Mark made mention of what's happening in Hoosick Falls, and Laureen has been a fierce champion for what is happening in Hoosick Falls and helping us understand that. The Hoosick Falls, New York PFOA contamination became national news 5 years ago, partly due to the seriousness of the drinking contamination, the drinking water contamination, but also due to state officials keeping it a secret for nearly a year and a half. Testing levels were such that the two St. Gobain facilities in Hoosick were listed as the first in the nation Superfund sites for PFOA contamination, as well as an additional site owned by Honeywell. In total, 5 more sites currently being investigated are currently being investigated in the small community. Laureen started the hashtag PFOA Project NY Twitter page in 2016 after the 2015 EPA revelation, and after learning her family's blood testing revealed some of the highest PFOA levels in her area, also correlating with linked illnesses. Laureen is a member of the Hoosick Falls Community Participation Working Group, and she's on the leadership committee of the National Pfas Contamination Coalition, comprised of advocacy groups in over 20 states. Laureen, welcome. How has your community reacted to information that they were heavily exposed to PFAS? And how do you see the state moving forward to identify and protect other communities from contamination?
Thanks, Ansje. Thanks for all having me. The one thing I can say about this very, very quiet, sleepy community is everybody stood up. The whole community stood up and advocated for itself. As was mentioned in the beginning, we weren't told for almost a year and a half that the water was contaminated, and it only took the then EPA administrator for our region, Jude Thank, to step in and tell Hoosick Falls to stop drinking the water. So that made headlines because we also were just coming off the announcements of Flint and whatnot. So Hoosick Falls has been in the news for a while. And while New York state officials stumbled badly in the beginning, I'd like to think that we're making some progress. Sometimes it's one step forward, 2 steps back. But even still, we still have some very passionate advocates here in Hoosick Falls. As we may end up in this community within 4 miles, we might end up with 10 Superfund sites. 3 are already federal. So we got dosed bad. The companies started using the Teflon products here in 1956. So we know we've been, it makes sense that we would have such high levels in our water and now in our bodies. We've had several rounds of biomonitoring. We know that there's more than just PFOA and PFAS in our blood. We know that the substitutes are getting in there, the more testing that they do. So we're still advocating for, one of the big issues we're having right now is those plants are still in operation. Those plants still aren't effectively stopping PFAS from coming out of their stacks. Air emissions, New York State did the one good thing and labeled PFOA and PFAS as hazardous substances, but only as regards to drinking water. The reason we got contaminated was from the PFAS contaminants coming out of the stacks of industry. And they're still not being regulated in any event in that way at all. So we're still in the process of having we have a community working group that meets with our DOH, DEC, and EPA monthly. This is one of the things that we're still complaining about, that there are no emissions controls for PFAS on the stacks of these plants, and they're not legally required to have them. So we know we're still being dosed at whatever levels because there's no standards for air emissions. So they'll give us some studies and say, well, it's only this many parts per trillion or parts per million. Well, you know what? What we're learning now is any of it's too much. So we're certainly on the path to advocating for class regulation. There's just too many out there, and as we can't wait every 2 years to get blood tests for 6, and then keep finding out there's more in us and more in us and more in us. As we know, they bioaccumulate. Our families here have been devastated. Our children here have been devastated with the levels that they have, and including my own family. And that's what started me advocating, is not only after finding out about the delay in letting us know that the water was contaminated, once we got the blood test back and a few months later, and my family's levels are hellacious. And it pissed me off enough to start a Twitter page. I'd never been on Twitter before. And so I've been, ever since, the page has morphed into, I share as much as I can read, health studies, information, statistics, articles, you name it. I share it on Twitter Monday through Friday. This is a full-time job for me now, because I know what it feels like to be first informed in this. I know what it feels like to have someone tell you your child's sick from related illnesses, or your doctor tell you you've got cancer from related, links to PFAS. And I'm also a cancer survivor. So I have many a reason to continue to advocate. And in Hoosick Falls, we still have a lot of work to do here. We have a municipal filtration system on our municipal supply, but and there's private well owners around here. There's over 800 that had to get POETs, point of entry systems, for their personal wells. But yet it sounds like those are good steps, which they are, but we still have so much work to do to clean up the contamination here, because we're in such an area where we encompass North Petersburg, which is right next to us, Bennington, Vermont, which is right next to us. So you got this 25-mile radius where it's just, everything's just contaminated. So cleanup is a big question. Superfund sites only clean up the site. How can you clean up Hoosick Falls? Well, that's going to be the question for every community. I don't think you can, but we'll work on it. But at least to stop exposure at this point is, I think, the main goal for all of us. Any exposures, drinking water, breathing it, ingesting it, eating it, putting it in on your makeup, wherever else it may be, the exposures need to stop. So that's one of the biggest, I think, things that every advocate that I work with that's line one, and then regulating these things. So that keeps us all going. We're all pretty busy. Oh, and we were also very fortunate to have Mr. Blott come when all of this came out. And he was so concerned, he came here on his own dime to testify at our hearings here in Hoosick Falls, and then another week later in Albany. And it was really educating our senators and our elected officials on this, because they just didn't get it. So another million thank yous to Mr. Bilott for coming to Hoosick Falls and staying in touch with some of us and continuing to help the battle.
Thanks. And thank you, Laureen and Mark, for your tireless efforts to not only protect and clean up your own communities, but paving the way to make sure all of our communities are clean. Last, we're going to hear from Eve Gartner. Eve is the managing attorney for the Toxic Exposure and Health Program at Earthjustice. Earthjustice is the largest nonprofit environmental law organization in the United States. It's the nation's largest not-for-profit environmental law firm. Her team uses litigation and other forms of legal activity to protect human health from toxic chemicals. They are doing work both in New York and across the country to get policymakers to adopt stronger protections from PFAS. Eve, welcome. What is the state of New York doing to address the PFAS crisis, and what more should they be doing? I'm going to add a little thing in there. Laureen mentioned addressing PFAS as a class, and maybe if you could also put that in there. What does that mean to address and regulate PFAS as a class?
Sure. Thank you, Ansje. It really is, for me, such a thrill to be part of this panel. And, Laureen and Mark, I'm just just in awe of that you keep going, really, that you have suffered so much and your families have suffered so much, and that you've channeled that anger to make the world a better place for others. And I'm just so grateful to you for doing that. And Rob, I know how hard it is to do what you do, and amazed at what you've accomplished. So New York has taken important steps, not enough, but has taken important steps over the last few years to limit both the ongoing use of PFAS in the state and to limit exposure from past use. And also to make the manufacturers of these chemicals, DuPont and 3M, and the companies that make the firefighting foam pay for their damage. Sierra Club, Earthjustice, and partner groups in the Just Green Partnership, which Caitlin mentioned earlier that Cecil Corbin-Mark was co-chair of. We've all played an important role in making this happen. So even though there's no federal maximum contaminant level for PFAS, so maximum contaminant level is how much of a chemical can be in your drinking water. New York's health department adopted some of the nation's strongest MCLs, or maximum contaminant level, for two of the PFAS. To Ansje's point, I think one of the problems about class, we know that, as Rob mentioned, there's thousands of PFAS out there. So it's great that we have a maximum level for two of the PFAS. But in an ideal world, we would have a maximum contaminant level that governed the entire class of PFAS. So that if there were any of that kind of carbon-fluorine bond detected in the water, there would be a limit on how much could come through your tap before there had to be some kind of filtering. In addition to adopting these MCLs for PFOA and PFOS, in the last 2 years, our legislature has adopted 3 bills. Last year, they adopted a bill that was signed into law that bans the use of firefighting foam with PFAS in it in training. And it also puts, and that's effective immediately. And then over the next couple of years, there will be a phase out of the use of any firefighting foam with PFAS. And I think, I don't know if anyone said this, but one of the main sources of PFAS in water, not in Hoosick Falls, but around the military bases like Mark was describing, is this firefighting foam that's been used for decades indiscriminately, filled with PFAS. And that's a lot of the source of the contamination. So getting PFAS firefighting foam banned in New York is a really important step to stop additional PFAS from getting in our water, though it doesn't really address the fact that so much of our water is already contaminated. So in addition to the firefighting foam bill, this year, the legislature passed a ban on PFAS in food packaging, and that's on the governor's desk waiting signature. Hopefully many of you got action alerts over the last day or two from Sierra Club and Earthjustice urging you to fill out that action alert and send an email to Governor Cuomo urging him to sign that bill. For people that don't have contaminated drinking water, PFAS in food is one of the key ways that people are getting exposed. So getting these chemicals out of our food packaging where it leaches into our food and into our bodies is really important. In addition, the legislature this year adopted a bill that bans incineration of that firefighting foam that I was just talking about. That bill and the food packaging bill still haven't been signed, but we're hoping that the governor will sign them both imminently. The incineration bill is really important. It actually comes out of a lawsuit that Earthjustice and Sierra Club filed last year, because once it became clear that the military had these stockpiles of this toxic firefighting foam at military bases literally all over the country, they agreed, the military agreed, the Department of Defense agreed that some of that foam, the older versions, the C8 version, was too toxic to use. But rather than dispose of it in a safe way or do research about what would be a safe way to dispose of it, they entered into contracts to simply incinerate this firefighting foam. And so one thing is that there's no study out there showing that this foam can be safely incinerated or what the protocols are for safe incineration. So DOD entered into contracts with incinerators all over the country, including in Cohoes, New York, right outside of Albany, that would result in these chemicals being incinerated, likely with the result that PFAS would be spewed into the air, into the surrounding communities. So hopefully Governor Cuomo will sign that bill momentarily as well. In addition, New York State has brought multiple lawsuits against DuPont, 3M, Chemours, which is a successor to DuPont that was spun off to try to shield DuPont's assets from judgments, from legal judgments. Those cases are pending. Several towns in New York, like Newburgh, have filed lawsuits, again, just trying to get compensation for the cleanup that these municipalities have had to undertake. Laureen, you didn't mention the fact that you've been part of an important lawsuit in Saint-Gobain, trying to get compensation for your community for the incredible harm that you've endured. And one important part of that lawsuit was that the court ruled that people in New York who've been exposed to PFAS, who have PFAS, measurable amounts of PFAS in their blood, are entitled to medical monitoring of the sort that Rob was fighting for in West Virginia. In New York, it wasn't established previously that was a remedy that was allowed, but through that litigation that Sierra Club and Earthjustice and others supported with an amicus brief, the court said, yes, the mere presence of PFAS is an injury that entitles people to medical monitoring. So all of this work in New York is important, but it's not enough. This is a national problem. There should be a federal response. And, we saw what happens if you leave it up to states. Well, then in some states, there's, DuPont or 3M are going to control the decision-making and not end up with strong standards. So in addition to setting MCLs, as Laureen was mentioning, this is a major air pollution problem, and there's no regulation of PFAS being emitted from facilities into the air. So a huge gap that really needs to be filled is regulation of PFAS in the air. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg, because we have seen that what's happened with PFAS, the fact that these chemicals, this whole class of chemicals, has gone under the radar, that there's been virtually no federal regulation, no water regulation, no air regulation. These chemicals continue to be approved by EPA. Even now, EPA is approving more and more PFAS to enter commerce. Why is this happening? Why is it that PFAS are not regulated as Superfund chemicals, so that when there's a cleanup, the responsible parties have to pay for it? There's so much more that needs to be done at a federal level and also at a state level to get a better handle on these chemicals. And again, to Ansje's point at the beginning, what we need to do is regulate these chemicals as a class. We can't spend the next 1,000 years regulating them, one at a time. We need to get a handle on this entire class. Every single PFAS that has ever been tested has been found to be toxic. All of them by their nature are persistent. They don't break down. They will last forever in our bodies, in the water. And so we really are looking to the Biden administration to come in and get a handle on this really serious problem.
Thanks, Eve. And thank you so much to our panel for sharing your stories. We are going to open it up for the rest of the time for questions from the audience. As a reminder, go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we'll pick them up. We've already got a number of really good questions coming in. I'm going to jump right into a question for Laureen from Patricia Flood. How can you test to see how much PFAS is in your body?
New York State offered to do ours for free through their own program. I don't know that if you have to be in a contaminated community to get yours done. You can call the Department of Health for that. But in certain areas, I know they have been doing where they have found and are following through on the contamination processes. Newburgh, for instance, I know that's getting all going down there as well. I'm not quite sure about Long Island if they've gotten the biomonitoring going there, but there are labs. There's only a couple that will do individuals. There's only 2, I think. Well, there might be more now, but the last I knew was only 2, and it's expensive to do on your own. It was something like $800 to $1,000, which usually takes it out of people's hands if they want to do their own testing that way. But if you're in New York and you want to, call New York State Department of Health and see if you can get yours tested for free.
Thanks, Laureen. Question for Mark. How much awareness is there among military service members about their potential exposure to PFAS on their base or where they work?
Not much. That's very difficult because the information is not being released. In fact, in Colorado, there's never been an independent investigation of the military's contamination by the state or the EPA. The military is in charge of their own investigation of Peterson Air Force Base and at the Air Force Academy. So there's not much information that the military families are getting. And so that's why we have to do a lot of grassroots work and reach out to the VFW, American Legion, to try and educate veterans and hopefully, some active military in what's going on.
Thank you. Eve, there's a question here from Erica D. How widespread is this class of chemicals in other countries, and do any other countries regulate them?
That's a good question. It is a global problem. And, I don't know, Rob, you probably can speak to this as well as I could. I mean, we know there's serious problems in Australia, in the EU. They're literally, and Rob said it, they're literally found everywhere. The EU is beginning to take, I think, a better approach than we are, looking at PFAS as a class and trying to essentially creating a system where all PFAS would be prohibited unless there's proof that the use is an essential use. So it's kind of an essential use framing, but that's really just in its infancy. And I don't know, Rob, if there's anything you would add to that.
And before, Rob, you answer, can you just say a little bit about what does that mean, essential use?
So if there's some use of PFAS that is actually critical, and I don't mean because you don't want to put oil in your frying pan, but if there's some important machine part that's needed for some essential industrial process and nothing can replace the PFAS, that would be an essential use. So that's just an example, but it's essentially, it's trying to figure out where do we really need this? Where can it not be replaced? And it actually serves an important function. That would be an essential use. And other than that, we shouldn't be using PFAS.
Great, thanks. Rob, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, it is definitely a global problem. In addition to Australia and New Zealand, particularly these chemicals in the movie, it's focused on one particular plant that was using it to make Teflon. But as you've just heard, I mean, these chemicals have been used in so many different products, stain resistant, waterproof clothing, carpeting, fast food wrappers and packaging, computer chip, and in particular, firefighting foams. And one of the things that's really led to the discovery all over the planet is, as Mark was mentioning, these chemicals used in firefighting foams, particularly outside military bases. And the Department of Defense really started an aggressive program to go out and finally start sampling and looking for these chemicals in drinking water outside military bases. And it hasn't been just in the United States. And we're finding it, as Mark mentioned, all over in the United States outside bases, but overseas as well. And in fact, yeah, it's everywhere, particularly from these firefighting uses in Australia, New Zealand. There's been a lot of discussion here just in the last couple of weeks about a military base in Japan, where there's been massive contamination discovered from firefighting foam, and in Italy and in Germany, you name it. And so there definitely are efforts underway, particularly at the EU, for example, as you heard, to try to address these as a class. I think that concept is probably a little more advanced overseas, frankly, than it is here among regulators so far. Even at the UN, there's been discussion about how do we grapple this as a worldwide problem, because as you heard, this stuff doesn't just go into drinking water. All right, it's going out in particular, air emissions. You heard about the importance of air emissions, for example, in New York, that the highest concentrations outside of the DuPont plant in West Virginia were across the opposite direction of the water flow in Ohio because of the air emissions out of the stacks. This stuff moves incredibly through the air and through in soils as well. This stuff has been, for example, generated by wastewater treatment plants that create biosolids or sludges that over the years historically had been given away to farmers that then spread them on fields. And so now we've got contaminated crops and fields and soils. So it's an incredibly complex problem that's affecting all of our environmental media, air, water, soil, blood, and it's all over the world. So, to say, okay, well, we phased out making any more of it here in the United States, the C8s, the PFOA and PFOS, that's great that we're not making any more here, but it continues to be made elsewhere where it then travels the planet through the air, through the rain. And everything that was made the prior 70 years is still out there, still in our soils, still in our water, until we actually figure out how do we clean this up. So really, right now, there's been a lot of focus on let's stop those immediate exposures, which is critical. Stop it, get it out of our drinking water, stop, where it is in products or it's continuing to be made. But the real problem that's going to be coming here is, particularly for the scientists, is figuring out what do we do about what's already out there, not only in the soils, but in people as well. How do we get it out? What do we do about the fact that it's accumulating in us? So it's a long way of saying, yes, it's a very expansive global problem on multiple levels that I think is going to keep scientists and regulators, unfortunately, busy for a long time to come.
Yeah, I recently moved from New York to North Carolina a few years ago. And here in North Carolina, we have the chemical facility, which is got Gen X, which is the next generation, which was discussed at the end of the movie. And somebody near the Chemours facility found Gen X in their honey from the bees, which is just scary. Speaking of PFAS in our bodies and in people, Mark, you are treating COVID patients. Is there some evidence that's linking PFAS exposure to a weaker immune system? And what do you think people should know about this?
Yeah, definitely. PFAS, through research at Harvard, Rob could probably tell you more. And Laureen, yeah, PFAS has been shown, especially in children, to decrease the effectiveness of vaccines and also to decrease the immune responses in people. So, and also, lung function, and there's a lot of other things, but definitely the effectiveness of vaccines. So it's going to be, as Rob says, it's in 99% of the world's population, PFAS is in their blood. So now that everybody's trying to get a vaccine, what is, for COVID, what does this mean for COVID vaccines? Does this mean that, it will, have a role on the effectiveness of these vaccines? And so this is something that I'm definitely, concerned with as somebody that worked in a COVID ICU as we go into second wave, that thank God I never got sick, but unfortunately I don't have any antibodies either. So, so I'm definitely gonna, right now, ironically, I'm dependent on a 3M respirator to get me through all this. And I would hope I could depend on a vaccine, but, you know, we need to see, you know, how PFAS and these new COVID vaccines will interact with each other.
You know, and I'll jump in there. That's an incredibly important topic. And in fact, it's really an ongoing issue right now. In fact, there was just a new paper released, I think by Dr. Grandjean just a week or so ago on this very topic. And even the CDC ATSDR has a statement posted on their website now, you know, that they are undertaking research right now into this potential link, you know, between PFAS and any impact on COVID. And in fact, I guess to give you some indication of how serious an issue this is, the American Chemistry Council just issued a statement over the weekend, you know, in response to an article that came out in The Guardian, I think it was on Friday or Saturday, that had been mentioning this potential connection. And the chemical companies have, you know, issued a statement strongly attacking that. So, you know, it's I think going to be an incredibly important area of research, and one I think, you know, that we're all have incredible interest in. We want to make sure, you know, these chemicals, which have been shown to have impact to our immune system, you know, aren't going to be impacting this issue. It remains to be seen.
Thanks. So it was noted by Robert in the chat that this sounds like a monumental problem, as we've all been discussing. This is a question for the panel. If you have PFAS in your body, what is considered a safe level?
I'll take a stab at that. And I have been doing nothing but reading studies for 5 years now, just about daily. I have to be in the over 1,000 by now, I'm sure. And I think most would agree, whether they're, you know, toxicologists or cardiologists, there is no safe level. There has not been proven to be any safe level in a person's body for any of these chemicals, which is why you're seeing so many states having problems with setting MCLs, and they're all different because there is no recognized safe level of these contaminants.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I think that's correct. You know, nobody has actually come up with an identified safe dose level. And in fact, what's been happening, and particularly over the last year or so, is as additional research comes out, we're seeing effects at lower and lower levels. And that's what's really got, I think, the scientific community, the regulatory community, particularly concerned. And it's why if you look at the trend of the drinking water guidelines or MCLs or standards that have been coming out primarily by the states since the US EPA came out with its drinking water guideline in 2016, you see a fairly consistent trend. They're all getting lower and lower. And you know, the amount we accept in our water is going down and down and down as states look at this. And it's because as this research comes out, it's showing effects and risks at lower and lower levels. So that's something that's I think particularly concerning, particularly when you've got a chemical like this that stays in you and builds up over time. It's that persistence and the bioaccumulation. It's like a ticking time bomb. You know, it stays in you. It's not like other chemicals that we can flush out real quick. And as long as you weren't exposed to a certain amount that day, you know you're okay. This stuff stays in you for long periods of time. That's what's really given the scientific world fits about how do you handle that? How do you come up with drinking water numbers, safety levels with a chemical that behaves this way? And it's very difficult to do.
Rob, we're going to stick with you. There's a question from Maria. How are people and children now in Parkersburg, West Virginia, that drank the water? What's the cancer rate now? How is the water now? And what is DuPont using now? And where are the pollutants going?
Well, there's a couple of questions there. We were able to to reach a settlement with DuPont for that community in the Mid Ohio Valley back in 2005. And one of the first things that was done under that settlement is to get water filtration systems put in, not only for the public water supplies, but for people on private wells. So all of that went in over the next couple of years to filter the water for PFOA. And I'm happy to say that the systems that were put in, and by the way, DuPont now has to pay for these forever and to keep maintaining and operating these. They're keeping the levels down to about below detection in these water systems. So that's good. And because of that settlement too, and the fact that the panel was able to confirm links with 6 diseases with PFOA, everybody in that community is getting free medical monitoring going forward to be looking for these 6 diseases. And we had about 3,500 people in that community out of the 70,000 who came forward with one of those 6 diseases back in 2012 to 2013. Now, keep in mind, that's just the number of people who decided to actually bring a lawsuit. There probably were a lot more people who had one of those diseases who just didn't want to go against DuPont. A lot of those folks were DuPont employees in the community. So we had about 3,500 of those who brought those cases. We were able to resolve those in 2017. That community continues to be monitored, and I'm sorry to say that people continue to get diagnosed with cancers and other diseases in that community. I think the numbers obviously are going down over time, particularly since the filters have been put in. But that also underscores the importance of having this kind of medical testing and monitoring for exposed people so that people can get detections early. And so that the doctors, particularly doctors in the community, need to know what they're looking for. One of the things we found in that community that was most disturbing and most shocking, frankly, was none of the medical community really had ever heard of any of this, had ever been told any information about PFOA and the potential links. And it was only through this litigation and getting that information out there that the doctors began to even start to know to look for these things. So when we put together our medical monitoring panel, we made sure to make sure that was all posted online so that other communities across the country, when they find out they've been exposed, they at least can go to that website and share that information with their doctors and find out if there are things that they can maybe be tested for. And I'll give a free plug for that website. It's www.C-8, the letter C, the number 8, medicalmonitoringprogram.com. And that gives you the medical panel's proposal of what tests ought to be done to look for these conditions, so you could sit down with your doctor and talk about those things. Because, unfortunately, you got to know what you're looking for when you're dealing with exposures like this.
Thank you.
The other thing I'd like to quickly add, Ansje, if I could, the other thing that doctors are having a hard time with, even here as we talk to them and branch out more, and scientists, is we don't know the effects of all the PFAS. It's called the total body burden. You're never exposed to just one. We might know what PFOA can do, such as testicular cancer, kidney cancer, but we don't know what PFOA can do when it's mixed with PFOS, PFHXS, PFNA, PFBS, all the other things that we're getting exposed to at the same time when you come across these sites. So no one knows that yet. That's just, they can't even grasp it yet, the total body burden of these things.
And that reminds me, I'm sorry to jump in again, but there was another part of that question I forgot to answer. Somebody asked about what's going on now at that. After PFOA was phased out and after our settlement there, DuPont started making this stuff called Gen X, the replacement chemical down in North Carolina, as you guys all heard about. But what they're doing with it is it's being shipped up to that same plant in West Virginia, where they're still making Teflon, but now they're using Gen X. And where is it going? Right up the stacks into the air, right into the Ohio River and into the products. And what are we hearing? Oh, it's not regulated. So it's as if history is now repeating itself. And that Gen X has already been found in drinking water supplies down the Ohio River as far as Louisville, Kentucky. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have these discussions, so that people can see Look what we already did with one of these. And now here it is, we're doing this all over again, even at the same plant in the same place.
Yeah, it's a huge problem and we're all connected. So we've covered a lot of ground tonight and learned a lot about the variety of ways our panel has engaged to address the PFAS problem. So thank you, all of you, for all of your work on this. But I'd like to wrap up with a look toward the future. Where do you think we'll be in 5 years? What successes are we aiming for? And how will we know if we've been successful? Why don't we start with Mark?
I would guess in 5 years, you would have it regulated, PFAS regulated as a class. You would have, you know, the funding for water districts, because it's one thing to regulate it, but then for some communities, they have to also have the money to, you know, filter it out as well. So, you know, it's not, they go hand in hand. And I think, you know, to have most of it removed, the air, all these exposures dealt with. And I think as far as, you know, for military communities that don't have, you know, these options like lawsuits, I think, you know, we'll have a comprehensive congressional investigation to find out what happened, why it happened, and how to prevent it from happening again. Because if you look at, like Rob talked about, PFAS in Japan at the Marine base in Okinawa, the surrounding communities' blood levels are high, but the city is not allowed to go on the military base to find out where this contamination has come from. So we have to be able to get Congress is the only one who could really be a check on the Pentagon and investigate this situation.
Great. Laureen, where's our hope? Where are we in 5 years?
I'd like to see an EPA that does its job. And let's hope that that's in a few months versus a few years. Because without attention, without the science, without legislators and those that make the laws not paying attention to the science, we're going to get nowhere. And that's just been discouraging for the past few years. So regulation, whether it be in drinking water, air, food products, children's toys. There's a PFAS task force that they formed with congressional members. Part of the problem we have right now in New York, and I've been talking with DOH and DEC about this, about forming something similar in our state. I call PFAS a mutant octopus because just when you think you've got a handle on one, it grows 8 more arms. And then that one produces 8 more arms. It's kind of like that. So while New York has taken some good steps on the drinking water front, we still have to move on, you know, flame retardants and upholstery and products. And, you know, there's so many arms to this. So it's got to be a multifaceted approach with legislation in mind, with exposure, you know, stopping exposure in mind. So I'd like to see, you know, our elected officials, the ones who make the bills, actually paying attention to the science, listening to the doctors and whatnot, and moving forward with this, because they've been dragging behind for so long. I mean, when did Rob start doing this? In the early 90s? It's not like this is not new, you know? So no more pushing it off to the side, that's for sure. And one of the other things that's really important for us, now that all these people are exposed and now that all these people are sick, is physician education, which we've had a real problem with here, you know, and I've talked to many communities. I can go to a doctor a half hour from here, won't know what PFAS is, even with our contamination and our story. So that's a big push for me. Yeah, and any bills, again, on exposure. And then what do we do, like Rob said, from here, the cleanup between the costs, making polluters pay. That bill should have been passed like ages ago. We have to fight the American Chemistry Council over stuff like that. So there's a lot to do, but those are the top few for me.
Great. So going to Rob for your 5-year vision, and then Eve bringing us some hope, and then we're going to wrap it up with Caitlin.
Sure. Well, I think I am optimistic, cautiously optimistic, particularly at having events like this where we are all coming together and talking about this and making sure that not only do we know what's going on, our neighbors, where our family members, that everybody is talking about this now. And I think we're finally at the point where this story has reached the general public enough that it can't be buried again. I think this has been, every time it's kind of peeked out to the public, it got squelched for so many years, that having these discussions and having venues like this where we can all keep talking about it and keep insisting that these actions be taken. And I'm incredibly optimistic that we're going to get it done. And most importantly, I think we have to make sure that yes, the actions need to be taken to make sure this stuff is cleaned up, that there isn't any more of it, et cetera, but that the responsible companies are made to pay for this, not the taxpayers, not all of us, that are now having to deal with this. There are a handful of companies that made this stuff knowing this was going to happen. They should be paying for this. And I'm optimistic. I'm really hopeful, particularly with events like this. So again, thank you to everyone for doing this tonight and keeping this conversation going. Thank you.
Evie, take yourself off mute. There you go.
Hi. So I'm also optimistic. One thing I would say is that not only this kind of gathering, but this is one of the only bipartisan issues in the United States. When you look at Congress, bills that insist on stronger regulation of PFAS are some of the only bills that get bipartisan support of both Democrats and Republicans, especially in the really hard-hit states. This is something we can agree on as a country. There are very few things we can agree on, but the idea that people shouldn't be poisoned by their drinking water seems to be one of them. So I do, it's hard to really have a crystal ball, but I do think that this next administration is going to take this really seriously. And somebody said in the chat that, Joe Biden has, his son died of brain cancer, probably because of what he was exposed to, the toxins he was exposed to in Iraq. We'll never know. But I think, he led the war on cancer when he was vice president. I think he understands the idea of toxic exposure. I think we will see strict limits on air releases, a much stronger regulation in water. We have to just stop using any PFAS in our food packaging. There's some obvious no-brainers. We have to get it out of our frying pans and start to clean it up. And I do think that we are at a turning point now where enough people actually know what PFAS is. Even that's extraordinary to thought that 5 years ago, people would know what PFAS are. And now it really is, thanks in part to this movie and the books and all the work of people like Laureen and Mark. It's a household word. And I think that action will follow.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for everything that you do and for all of you for joining. And Caitlin, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I am just grateful to all of our panel members, for everyone that joined us tonight. You will be getting an email from me tomorrow. It will include an action alert because there are several, like we talked about, several bills on Governor Cuomo's desk awaiting his signature related to PFAS. Sonia had put the information in the chat about the bill numbers and his phone number. This is one of the bills is a ban on PFAS in food packaging, and the other is a ban on the incineration of the AFFF, the firefighting foam. We were hoping that it would be signed into law by tonight for the call, but we still haven't heard. I think if one more push tomorrow, hopefully it will be law by tomorrow, hopefully. So I thank everyone for participating. So grateful. Have a lovely Thanksgiving, everyone. Be safe. Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.